Imagine the year is 900 AD. You are in Scandinavia. The sun set at 2 in the afternoon and will not rise before 10 in the morning of the following day. Outside, the temperature has dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The wind doesn't just blow, it bites your skin, capable of freezing your extremities in minutes. Today, you push a button and your house gets warm. But the Vikings? They didn't have electricity. They didn't have modern thermal insulation. And surprisingly, they didn't even have fireplaces as we know them today, those with pretty chimneys on the wall. Yet, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They raised families, forged steel, and planned empires in the middle of a white inferno that would kill a modern man in hours. How was this possible? How did they transform wooden huts into heat furnaces without suffocating from the smoke? The answer involves forgotten engineering, a disgusting secret about wall insulation, and a diet that would make your cardiologist faint. Get ready. Let's step inside the Longhouse and discover how history's most feared warriors conquered their greatest enemy, winter. To understand how a Viking didn't freeze to death in his sleep, you need to forget everything you know about modern houses. Today we build houses to be beautiful, with large windows and high ceilings. For a Norseman of the Viking Age, that would be a death sentence. Their house, the famous Longhouse or Langhus, was not just a shelter, it was a thermally designed survival machine. The first thing you would notice when approaching one of these houses is not the wood, but the earth. The exterior walls were often not made of just planks, but of thick layers of turf, a type of brick made of grass and compacted earth. Why earth? Because wood, on its own, lets the wind through the cracks. Earth is a brutally efficient thermal insulator. It creates a thermal mass that absorbs the little heat of the day and holds it in during the night. It was like living inside an artificial cave, but man-made. The design was no accident either. Longhouses had an oval shape, resembling an upside-down boat. This wasn't just aesthetics. Winter winds in Scandinavia can knock down trees. Straight walls, like those in our square houses, take the full impact of the wind, robbing the structure of heat. The Vikings' curved walls made the wind slide off the house, drastically reducing wind chill. But the real engineering secret was in the roof. If you look at a Viking house, you'll see grass growing on top. It's not a garden. That turf roof, which could weigh tons, acted like a giant blanket. In winter, snow fell on that roof and, ironically, helped with insulation. Snow is an excellent insulator because it traps air inside. So, you had wood, earth grass, and a layer of snow separating you from the frozen cosmos outside. Now, let's go inside. As you pass through the door, which was intentionally low and small to prevent heat from escaping every time someone entered, you would notice something strange. The floor. In many of these buildings, the floor was made of packed earth, sometimes sunken, slightly below the level of the exterior ground. This took advantage of the Earth's natural geothermal energy, which is always warmer than the freezing surface air. And the windows? Forget about it. Glass was alien technology or extreme luxury from the south. Longhouses had virtually no windows in the side walls. Having a hole in the wall was inviting death in. The only significant opening was in the roof. And this brings us to the most critical point of this architecture, the control of airflow. You must be wondering, if there are no windows and the walls are made of earth, how did they breathe? Ventilation was calculated down to the millimeter. The house needed to be airtight enough to retain heat, but open enough not to asphyxiate the inhabitants with carbon monoxide. It was a deadly balance. If they closed them too much, they would suffocate. If they opened them too much, they would freeze to death. A longhouse was, essentially, a living organism. It needed daily maintenance. If the peat dried out too much, it cracked and the cold got in. If it got too wet in the summer, the wood rotted. The average Viking spent a good part of the autumn caulking their house. They used moss, old wool, and even animal dung mixed with mud to seal every tiny crack between the wooden planks. Think about it. Your survival depended on how well you plugged a hole with moss months before the first snowflake fell. This shows that the battle against winter began long before the cold arrived. Viking architecture wasn't primitive. It was an evolutionary response to an environment that wanted to kill you. But even with all this insulation, a cold house is still a cold house. Insulation only holds the heat. It doesn't create it. To generate heat, they needed a beating heart inside the house. And this is where the story gets steamy and where the myth of the fireplace falls apart. Because what they had inside was much more primitive and, at the same time, much more effective at warming large groups of people. If the turf walls were the body of the Viking home, the fire was its soul. But we need to dispel a very cozy romantic image that movies have planted in our heads. When we think of a fireplace, we picture a safe, contained brick box with a chimney that whisks the smoke away, leaving us with nothing but warmth and the crackle of logs. The Vikings had none of that. They didn't have chimneys. In fact, the technology of the chimney wouldn't become common in Europe for centuries. Instead, the Vikings lived with a fire that was wild open and sitting right in the middle of their floor. This central fire was known as the Langeld, or the Long Fire. It wasn't a small campfire circle like you might make when camping. It was a long, rectangular trench dug directly into the earth floor, lined with stones, running down the center spine of the longhouse. In the largest chieftain halls, this trench could be incredibly long, creating a corridor of heat that allowed dozens of people to sit on either side. This design was deliberate. A single round fire creates a hot spot. If you are close to it, you burn, and if you are 3 meters away, you freeze. The long fire distributed the heat evenly across the length of the living space, ensuring that everyone, from the Jarl to the thrall, received a share of the warmth. But this open fire presented a deadly engineering challenge: smoke. Without a chimney to suck the exhaust upward, where did the smoke go? It went everywhere. The Viking solution to this was simple but imperfect. They left a hole in the roof, usually directly above the fire, called a lore. The idea was that the hot smoke would rise and exit through the vent. However, physics is rarely that cooperative, especially in a Scandinavian winter. When the wind is howling outside at 50 miles per hour, it creates a pressure barrier. Often, the smoke wouldn't exit. It would hit the cold air coming down from the vent and be pushed back inside. This created a phenomenon known as the smoke layer. If you walked into a longhouse during winter, you wouldn't be able to stand up straight. The upper half of the room was a permanent, thick cloud of stinging, blinding smoke. The Vikings lived their lives in the bottom half of the room, beneath the smog. This is why the benches and beds were low to the ground. If you stood up too quickly, you would be coughing instantly. It was a life lived on a horizontal plane. The smoke, however, wasn't entirely an enemy. In a world without preservatives, the smoke was a tool. The ceiling area, while uninhabitable for humans, was the perfect place to hang meat and fish. The constant bath of smoke cured the food, preventing it from rotting and keeping the family fed through the months when hunting was impossible. Furthermore, the soot coated the timbers of the roof, hardening the wood and repelling insects and termites that might otherwise eat the house. The smoke was a slow poison to the lungs, but a savior for the stomach and the shelter. Maintaining this fire was a full-time job that required an intuitive understanding of fuel. We assume they just burned wood, but in many parts of the Viking world, like Iceland or the Orkney Islands, trees were scarce or non-existent. You couldn't just chop down a forest that didn't exist. So, what did they burn? They burned the earth itself. They harvested peat, decayed vegetation found in bogs that, when dried, burns with a slow, hot intensity. Peat harvesting was a summer labor that determined winter survival. They would cut thousands of blocks of this turf, dry them in the wind, and stack them. When burned, peat doesn't crackle like pine, it smolders. It gives off a distinct oily smoke that smells earthy and pungent. It coats everything in a fine layer of greasy soot. If you met a Viking in the winter, their skin would likely be stained gray, their clothes smelling permanently of ancient, burning earth. In areas where even peat was scarce, they turned to even more desperate measures. Dried animal dung was a common fuel source. Sheep and cow dung, when fully dried, burns surprisingly well. It creates a steady heat, though the aroma is exactly what you would expect. They also burned bones. Animal bones, rich in marrow and fat, could be thrown into the fire to boost the temperature. It was a brutal cycle. They ate the animal, wore its skin, and burned its waste and bones to stay alive. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. The management of the Langeld was almost a religious duty. You have to remember, starting a fire in the Viking Age wasn't a matter of flicking a lighter. They used flint and steel, striking sparks into charred cloth or dried fungus called touchwood. Doing this with frozen fingers in the dark at 4 in the morning was a nightmare. Therefore, the goal was to never let the fire go out. At night, they wouldn't extinguish the flames. They would bank the fire. This involved covering the glowing embers with a layer of ash or fresh peat to starve the fire of oxygen just enough so it wouldn't burn out, but wouldn't flare up and burn the house down while everyone slept. In the morning, the person responsible for the hearth would uncover the embers, blow gently to feed them oxygen, and add fresh fuel. If the fire died, it was considered a bad omen, a sign that the spirits of the house had left. Practically, it meant the temperature in the house would plummet within an hour, and relighting it would be a struggle against when the embers of the long fire faded to a dull red glow and the temperature inside the longhouse began its inevitable slide toward freezing. The Vikings didn't reach for a thermostat. They didn't have space heaters. At that moment, their survival depended entirely on what they were wearing and who they were sleeping next to. If the longhouse was the fortress, their clothing was their armor. But this armor wasn't made of iron or steel, which would suck the heat right out of your body. It was made of something far more valuable in the north, the hair of a sheep. To understand why Vikings didn't freeze to death, you have to understand the miracle technology that is wool. Today, we take fabrics for granted. We have Gore-Tex, polyester, and thermal synthetics. But in the 9th century, wool was the absolute pinnacle of survival gear. It has a property that modern science still struggles to replicate perfectly. It keeps you warm even when it is soaking wet. In the damp, snowy, and maritime climate of Scandinavia, staying dry was impossible. You were going to get wet. Cotton, which we wear today, kills you in the cold. If cotton gets wet, it loses its insulating ability and sucks heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. It's a death sentence. Wool is different. The fibers of Viking sheep were rich in lanolin, a natural waxy oil produced by the animal. The Vikings knew not to overwash their wool during processing. They wanted that oil to stay in the fiber. This made their tunics and cloaks naturally water repellent. Rain and melting snow would beat off the surface rather than soaking in. But even if the water did penetrate, the structure of the wool fiber traps air pockets, maintaining a thermal barrier against the skin. A Viking could fall into a freezing stream, climb out, and his clothes would still generate heat as he moved. It was a self-heating wetsuit. The layering system they used was surprisingly modern. Against the skin, they typically wouldn't wear wool, because raw, oily wool is incredibly itchy. Instead, they wore an undershirt made of linen. Linen, made from the flax plant, is smooth and breathes well. It wicked moisture and sweat away from the body, moving it to the outer wool layer where it could evaporate. This kept the skin dry, which is the golden rule of cold weather survival. Over this linen base layer came the wool tunic, and over the tunic, the most iconic piece of Norse gear, the cloak. A Viking cloak wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a mobile house. These were heavy, thick rectangular pieces of woven wool, sometimes lined with fur. When a Viking traveled or slept, this cloak served as a blanket, a windbreak, and a sleeping bag. They would pin it at the shoulder with a brooch, leaving the sword arm free, but in deep winter, they could wrap themselves entirely in it. The quality of your cloak told the world who you were. A dyed cloak, red or blue, meant you were wealthy and powerful. A plain, undyed brown cloak meant you were a commoner. But regardless of color, the function was the same, trapping a bubble of warm air around the torso. But what about the extremities? Frostbite usually claims the fingers and toes first. Here, the Vikings used a technique called nullbinding. It looks like knitting to the untrained eye, but it's actually an ancient form of knotting using a single needle. This technique created socks and mittens that were virtually indestructible. Unlike modern knitting, if you snagged a thread in nullbinding, the whole garment wouldn't unravel because each loop was knotted individually. They would wear thick wool socks, and inside their leather shoes, they would often stuff dried grass or extra raw wool. This acted as disposable insulation, creating air gaps between the foot and the freezing ground. Yet clothing alone wasn't enough for the knights. When darkness fell for 18 hours a day, the activity stopped, and the metabolism slowed down. The body produces less heat when sleeping. To counter this, the Vikings engaged in a practice that modern society has largely abandoned: communal sleeping. We value privacy. We have separate bedrooms for parents and children. In a Viking winter, privacy was a luxury they could not afford. Privacy meant freezing. The sleeping platforms in the longhouse were lined along the walls. They were wide, often filled with straw and covered with furs. The entire family, and often the extended household, would sleep together in these beds. They created a puppy pile of humanity. This is simple thermodynamics. A single human body radiates about 100 watts of heat. If you sleep alone, that heat radiates into the cold room and is lost. If you sleep pressed against 3 other people, you are sharing a collective heat source of 400 watts, insulated by furs. They became a biological battery, recharging each other through the night. The warmth of a child was protected by the warmth of the mother, who was shielded by the warmth of the father. For the extremely wealthy, there was an upgrade to the system: the box bed, or lokrekia. These were literally closets built into the wall with doors that could close. It looks claustrophobic to us, sleeping in a wooden coffin, but it was the ultimate luxury. By closing the doors, the sleeper created a microclimate. The body heat of the occupants would rapidly heat up the small, enclosed volume of air inside the box, raising the temperature significantly higher than the rest of the drafty hall. It was a room within a room, a sanctuary of warmth. The bedding itself was a major industry. While the poor slept on sheepskins, the rich slept on something that is still the gold standard today: eiderdown. The Vikings harvested the soft, insulating feathers from the nests of the eider duck. This down is incredibly light, but traps heat better than almost any synthetic material ever invented. A wealthy jarl lying in a box bed, under a quilt of eiderdown, wearing linen and wool, was likely as warm as you are in your heated apartment today. But there's a catch to all this insulation and shared body heat: hygiene. You might think that if the longhouse was the shell and the fire was the heart, then food was the fuel. But in a Viking winter, food wasn't about culinary enjoyment. It wasn't about flavor profiles or presentation. Food was a mathematical equation of survival. To understand the Viking diet, you first have to understand the caloric demands of the cold. When a human body is exposed to freezing temperatures, it shivers. Shivering is your muscles vibrating to generate heat, and it is incredibly expensive in terms of energy. A modern office worker needs about 2,000 calories a day. A Viking chopping wood in the snow, repairing a boat, or simply existing in a drafty hall needed double that, maybe even triple. They needed 4,000 to 5,000 calories just to maintain their body temperature. If they dropped below that intake, they wouldn't just lose weight, they would lose the ability to generate heat. Hypothermia would set in from the inside out. So, what do you eat when the ground is frozen solid, the crops are dead, and the ocean is a stormy death trap? You eat fat. Massive, nauseating amounts of fat. To a modern palate obsessed with lean meat and low carbs, a Viking winter meal would be repulsive. They didn't trim the fat off the meat. The fat was the prize. They craved it. They stored butter in large wooden kegs, sometimes burying it in bogs to ferment and preserve it for years. This bog butter would turn rancid and waxy, tasting like strong cheese, but it was pure, concentrated energy. They didn't just spread butter on bread. They ate it in chunks. They added it to stews. They drank it in broths. Every gram of fat contains 9 calories compared to 4 in protein or carbs. Fat was the highest octane fuel available, and they burned it as fast as they could eat it. But you can't survive on butter alone. You need protein. And since fishing in the midwinter Atlantic was often a suicide mission, the Vikings relied on a preservation technique that turned fish into something resembling a plank of wood. This is the stockfish. Visit Norway today, and you will still see them. Massive of frame racks with thousands of cod hanging by their tails, drying in the freezing wind. The cold air sucks the moisture out of the fish before it can rot, while the salt in the sea breeze cures it. The result is a fish stick that is hard as a rock and can last for years without spoiling. To eat it, a Viking would have to take a hammer to the fish, smashing the fibers to soften them, before soaking it in water or sour whey. It was chewy, salty, and tough, but it was 80% protein. It was a superfood. A Viking could carry a piece of dried stockfish in his pocket and chew on it all day, like gum, getting a constant drip feed of nutrition. It was lightweight, durable, and kept them alive when the granaries were empty. However, the real genius of their survival diet, and the part that would make your stomach turn, was fermentation. We used refrigerators to stop bacteria from growing. The Vikings used good bacteria to fight the bad bacteria. They didn't just dry meat, they pickled it. But they didn't have endless supplies of salt, which was expensive. Instead, they used a byproduct of their dairy farming, mysa or sour whey. When they made skyr, a type of soft cheese or thick yogurt that was a staple of their diet, the leftover liquid was acidic whey. They quickly realized that this acid killed the bacteria that caused botulism and rot. So they would take barrels of cooked meat, lamb, horse, seal, whale, and sink them into vats of this sour, fermented liquid. Imagine sitting down to dinner in January. The wind is howling outside. You are served a bowl of meat that has been floating in sour milk acid for 4 months. It is gray. It smells pungent and acidic. But it is safe. And more importantly, it is full of vitamins. This brings us to the silent killer of the North, scurvy. You can have a belly full of meat and still rot alive if you don't get vitamin C. With no fresh fruits or vegetables for 6 months, how did they avoid their teeth falling out? They ate the parts of the animal we throw away. They ate the liver, the brain, and the eyes. Organ meats are surprisingly high in vitamins. They also gathered berries in the autumn, cloudberries and lingonberries, and froze them or preserved them in that same sour whey. But perhaps their most surprising source of vitamins came from their drink. The water in a Viking village wasn't always safe. It was often downstream from the livestock. So they drank ale and mead. But Viking ale wasn't the clear, bubbly beer we have today. It was a thick, unfiltered porridge of grain, yeast, and water. It was low in alcohol, maybe only 2 or 3%, so they could drink it all day without getting falling down drunk. But because it was unfiltered, it was rich in B vitamins and suspended grain particles. It was liquid bread. Drinking this ale provided hydration, calories, and nutrients in one go. In the winter, the brewing kettle was constantly bubbling. We have talked about the freezing wind, the smoke-filled lungs, and the diet of rancid fat. But there is a fourth enemy in a Viking winter, one that is invisible and often more dangerous than the cold itself. It is the darkness. In the far north, the sun disappears. In parts of Norway and Iceland, the polar night means weeks or even months where the concept of daytime is nothing more than a few hours of gloomy blue twilight. This wreaks havoc on the human brain. We know it today as seasonal affective disorder SAD, but for the Vikings, it was simply a reality that could drive a person to madness. They were locked in a crowded, smelly, dark hall, shoulder to shoulder with the same people, day after day. The potential for violence was catastrophic. So, how did a society of warriors, famous for their aggression and short tempers, not tear each other apart in a fit of cabin fever? They didn't just sit there staring at the fire. They constructed a complex psychological defense system made of games, poetry, and strict social laws. First, they channeled their aggression onto a board. Archaeologists have found game boards and pieces in almost every significant Viking burial site, from boat graves to cremation urns. The most famous of these was Hnefatafl, or the King's Table. To the casual observer, it looks like chess, but the psychology behind it is completely different. Chess is a fair fight. Both sides start with equal armies. Hnefatafl is unfair by design. It places a single king in a small guard in the center of the board, surrounded on all 4 sides by a much larger army of attackers. The king's goal isn't to kill everyone, it is to escape. The attacker's goal is to capture him. This game was an obsession. It wasn't just a way to pass time, it was a simulation of their reality. Every Viking understood the feeling of being outnumbered and surrounded by hostile forces, whether those forces were enemy armies or the winter elements themselves. Playing the game allowed them to exercise their tactical minds and vent their competitive fury without drawing a sword. The The clatter of game pieces made of whalebone or amber on a wooden board was the soundtrack of the winter. It was a mental workout that kept their strategic instincts sharp while their bodies were confined. But a board game can only hold your attention for so long. To truly escape the walls of the longhouse, they needed to travel. Since they couldn't travel physically, they traveled mentally. They built the Netflix of the North. They relied on the skalds. A skald was not just a poet. He was a historian, a journalist, and a celebrity entertainer rolled into one. In a culture with no written books for the common man, the skald held the entire memory of the people in his head. When the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, the skald would take the high seat. The room would fall silent. He wouldn't just speak, he would perform. He used a complex, rhythmic verse called drotvet, which had strict rules of rhyme and alliteration. This rhythm made the stories hypnotic and easier to memorize. He told tales of Thor battling giants, of Loki's betrayals, and of great ancestors who killed dragons. These stories served a dual purpose. First, they were escapism. They transported the listeners out of the dark, smelly hut and into the glittering halls of Valhalla. Second, and more importantly, they reinforced the social code. The stories taught the children that cowardice was worse than death, that hospitality was a sacred duty, and that fate word was inescapable. It gave meaning to their suffering. If the gods could endure pain, so could they. It provided a spiritual armor against the depression of the long night. However, a Viking mind is a pragmatic mind. Stories and games are fine for the evening, but idleness during the day breeds resentment. The devil finds work for idle hands is a later Christian saying, but the Vikings understood the concept perfectly. The longhouse in winter was a factory. The women were the engines of this industry. We mentioned earlier that wool was their armor. That armor took months to create. The sound of the loom, the clack, clack, clack of the beater against the threads, was the heartbeat of the house. Spinning thread with a drop spindle could be done even in the dim light. It was meditative, repetitive work that kept the hands busy and the mind focused. The men, unable to farm or raid, turned to repair and craft. They carved combs from antlers, forged nails from bog iron, and repaired the strakes of their ships. This is a critical point. The Viking ship, the technological marvel of the age, was often built or refurbished in the winter. If the longhouse was big enough, smaller boats might be brought inside or worked on in a sheltered lean-to. They spent the winter preparing for the spring. This gave them a sense of future. They weren't just surviving the winter, they were investing in the summer. Having a goal is the best cure for depression. Yet put enough people in a small space, and conflict is inevitable. Someone steals a piece of bread. Someone insults another man's wife. In a society where honor... For 4 chapters, we have been trapped inside. We have smelled the smoke, felt the heat of the bodies, and tasted the sour whey. But a Viking could not hibernate like a bear. The resources inside the longhouse were finite. Eventually, the woodpile shrinks, the meat barrels empty, and the claustrophobia becomes unbearable. They had to go out. To the modern mind, 6 feet of snow is a barrier. It stops cars, cancels flights, and shuts down cities. But to the Vikings, the snow wasn't a wall. It was a highway. In fact, for the Norse people, winter was often the best time to travel. In the summer, the Scandinavian landscape is a nightmare of dense forests, jagged rocks, and impassable, mosquito-infested swamps. But when the deep freeze hits, the world smooths out. The lakes turn into flat sheets of ice, and the jagged rocks are buried under a white blanket. The world becomes a blank canvas. To cross it, they used a technology so fundamental to their identity that they worshipped a god solely dedicated to it. They called it ski. This is the Old Norse word for a split piece of wood, and it is where we get the modern word ski. But if you handed a pair of Viking skis to a modern Olympian, they would likely fall on their face. The design was radically different, built not for downhill speed, but for cross-country endurance and hunting efficiency. Archaeological finds, like the ones in marshes across Sweden and Norway, reveal a fascinating asymmetry. Often, a Viking skier wouldn't wear 2 identical skis. They wore one long ski, the glider, on their left foot, which could be up to 3 meters long. On their right foot, they wore a shorter, broader ski known as the andor. The bottom of this short ski was covered in fur, usually seal or reindeer skin, with the hair pointing backward. This acted like a natural engine. The Viking would glide on the long left ski and kick against the snow with the short right ski. The backward-facing fur would grip the snow, giving them traction to push off, then slide forward instantly. It was less like modern skiing and more like riding a scooter. They didn't use two poles. They used a single, long, stout pole. This pole wasn't just for balance. It was a brake, a spear, and a weapon. With this setup, a skilled Norseman could cover immense distances with minimal energy. They moved silently, like ghosts across the white expanse. This mobility was the difference between starving and feasting. The primary reason to leave the warmth of the fire was the hunt, and in the winter, the balance of power between predator and prey shifted dramatically in favor of the human. Imagine a moose or an elk. It is a massive, powerful beast. In the summer, it can outrun any human. But in deep snow, its weight is its downfall. Every step a moose takes breaks through the crust, sinking it belly deep in the powder. It has to fight for every inch of movement. This is called post-holing, and it is exhausting. The Viking, floating on top of the snow with his wooden planks, simply had to follow. The hunt was a persistence hunt. The skier didn't need to be faster than the elk. He just needed to be efficient. He would track the animal for hours, gliding effortlessly while the beast plowed through the drifts, burning its energy reserves. Eventually, the animal would simply collapse from exhaustion, unable to take another step. The snow, which was the animal's prison, was the Viking's platform. This provided fresh meat and, crucially, fresh furs to repair the bedding and clothing back at the longhouse. But snow wasn't the only surface they had to conquer. Scandinavia is a land of lakes and fjords. When these froze, they became the fastest trade routes in the world. To navigate the ice, the Vikings didn't use skis. They used ijsleg. If you look at these artifacts in a museum, they look primitive, almost barbaric. They are made from the metatarsal bones of horses or cows. The Vikings would shave one side of the bone flat and drill holes in the ends to strap them to their leather boots. These were the ancestors of ice skates. However, you couldn't skate on them like a hockey player. Bone doesn't have a sharp edge like steel. It doesn't bite into the ice. If you tried to push off to the side, your feet would just slip out from under you. Instead, the Viking skaters stood with their feet shoulder-width apart and used a spiked pole between their legs to push themselves backward, propelling them forward. It was a motion similar to punting a boat or pulling a raft. On a frozen lake, a man on bone skates could move faster than a horse galloping on land. This allowed for rapid communication between isolated farms. It allowed them to check ice fishing lines quickly. It turned the frozen water, which would be a death sentence to a swimmer, into a bridge. This mastery of winter travel was so deeply embedded in their culture that it ascended into their religion. They worshipped Ullr, the stepson of Thor. Ullr wasn't a god of thunder or war. He was the god of the snowshoe, the ski, and the bow. In the myths, Ullr is described as a beautiful figure, skimming across the mountains on his magical bone shield, which many interpret as a metaphor for a sled or ski. There was also Skadi, the giantess associated with winter, skiing, and bow hunting. The fact that the Norse pantheon included specific deities for skiing proves that this wasn't just a hobby. It was a divine skill. To be a clumsy skier was to be less of a man, less favored by the gods. This mobility also had a military application. While large-scale warfare usually paused in the winter, scouting and raiding did not. A small group of men on skis could descend upon a rival farm, strike, and vanish back into the white wilderness before a defense could be mounted. They were the original winter special forces. The famous Birkebeiner warriors of later Norwegian history, who saved the infant king by skiing him over the mountains in a blizzard, were continuing a tradition that started in the Viking Age. But there is a limit to technology. You can build the warmest house. We often think of the Vikings dying in a storm of steel on a battlefield with an axe in hand, screaming a prayer to Odin. That is the Hollywood death. That is the death they wanted. But the reality of the Viking Age was that the greatest killer wasn't a Saxon sword or a Frankish spear. It was the winter cough. It was the infection that started in a small cut and turned black. It was the silent, invisible army of microbes that flourished in the damp, crowded darkness of the longhouse. When a blizzard locks 80 people and 20 farm animals into a single room for 4 months, that room becomes a biological petri dish. We established that the smoke from the fire killed airborne bugs, but it also shredded their lungs. Chronic bronchitis and smoke inhalation damaged the cilia in their throats, the body's first line of defense. Once the lungs were weakened, pneumonia, the chest sickness, could sweep through a household like a firestorm. In a world without antibiotics, pneumonia was often a death sentence. So, when the fever spiked and the chest rattled, what could they do? They didn't have hospitals. They had the vulva. The vulva was the seeress, the witch, but also the doctor. In the Viking mind, medicine and magic were not separate things. They were the same thread. A sickness wasn't seen as a virus. It was viewed as a spiritual attack, perhaps a curse from a rival, or elf shot, invisible arrows fired by mischievous spirits. To cure the body, you had to treat the soul. However, beneath the chanting and the runes, there was genuine, effective herbal medicine. The Vikings were masters of the natural pharmacy. Their penicillin was a plant called angelica or quan. This wasn't just a weed, it was a commodity so valuable it was protected by law in the Viking law codes, the Gulathing. Farmers cultivated it in special gardens. Why? Because the root of the angelica plant is a powerhouse of essential oils and antiseptics. In the dead of winter, chewing on a dried angelica root could boost the immune system, settle the stomach, and help fight off scurvy. They also used sphagnum moss. If you cut your hand while carving wood by the fire, you didn't have band-aids. You grabbed a clump of dried moss. This moss is sterile, highly absorbent, it can hold 20 times its weight in liquid, and contains mild antibiotic properties. It was the perfect field dressing. For pain, they brewed teas from willow bark, which contained salicin, the chemical ancestor of aspirin. They were treating pain with aspirin 1,000 years before the pill was invented. But sometimes the moss and the willow bark weren't enough. The fever would win. The breathing would stop. And this created the most terrifying logistical problem a Viking family could face: a corpse in January. In the modern world, death is handled by professionals. In the Viking Age, death was a domestic chore, and in the winter, the earth refused to accept the dead. The ground in Scandinavia freezes solid. It becomes as hard as granite. You cannot dig a grave with an iron shovel or a wooden pick. You would break your tools before you broke the soil. This presented a horrific dilemma. You have a dead body. You cannot keep it inside the longhouse, because even in the cold, a body will begin to decompose, smell, and spread disease. But you cannot bury it, and you cannot simply leave it outside in the snow, because the wolves and foxes, starving in the winter, would desecrate it. To a Viking, having your ancestor eaten by scavengers was a spiritual catastrophe that could bar them from the afterlife. The solution was the corpse wall. They would take the body, wash it, dress it in their finest clothes, and then wrap it tightly in linen or hides. Then they would place the body in a temporary structure, often a shed, or sometimes just a snowbank reinforced with stones, where the freezing temperatures would preserve it. Essentially, they put their loved ones into a deep freeze. It creates a haunting image, a family going about their daily chores, knowing that grandma or the little brother is lying frozen stiff, just outside the wall, waiting for the spring thaw. This waiting period could last for 3 or 4 months. This proximity to the unburied dead gave rise to one of the most terrifying monsters in Norse folklore, the dragger. A dragger is not a ghost. A ghost is a spirit. A dragger is a reanimated corpse. It is a zombie, but far more dangerous. The Vikings believed that if a person was evil in life, or if they were not treated with respect in death, their body would swell up with dark energy. The drag was described as being heavier than a living man, and possessing superhuman strength. They didn't just haunt, they crushed. They would climb onto the roofs of the houses and stomp. driving the inhabitants mad. They would slaughter livestock. They would drag the living down into the grave. The fear of the Draugr was so real that it dictated how they handled the dead body during that dangerous waiting period. They practiced preventative magic. They might place a pair of open iron scissors on the chest of the corpse. Iron was believed to repel evil spirits. They might tie the big toes of the corpse together so the legs couldn't walk. They might even drive needles into the soles of the feet to make walking painful for the undead. But the most fascinating precaution was the corpse door. If a person died inside the longhouse, the Vikings would often refuse to carry the body out through the main front door. They believed that the dead only remember the way they left. If you carried them out the front door, the Draugr would know how to get back in. So they would break a hole in the wall, a literal hole. They would push the body through this temporary opening and then immediately seal it back up with fresh timber and stone. To the spirit of the dead, the exit had vanished. They were confused, unable to find the entrance, trapped outside in the cold where they belonged. This fear adds a layer of psychological horror to the winter. Imagine sitting in the dark, hearing the wind thump against the roof and wondering, is that the storm? Or is that the uncle we put in the snowbank last week trying to get back in? Yet no matter how long the night, the physics of the planet always win. The earth tilts back. The sun, which had been a stranger, begins to linger for an hour longer, then 2. The air changes. The first sign of survival wasn't warmth, it was sound. The sound of the ice heave. As the temperature fluctuates in early spring, the massive sheets of ice on the lakes and fjords begin to crack and shift. It sounds like thunder or a cannon fire, booming across the valleys. To the Vikings, this wasn't scary. It was the music of victory. It meant the grip of the frost giants was breaking. The thaw of the lacing brought mud. Oceans of mud. But it also brought the future. The survival phase was over. The calories they had hoarded were gone. The bodies they had stored could finally be buried with proper rites, sending them to the ancestors. Now, the mindset shifted instantly from defense to offense. The sun has returned, the ice has cracked, the long siege of darkness is broken. In a modern movie, this is the moment the music swells, the flowers bloom, and everyone cheers. But in the reality of the Viking Age, the arrival of spring was not a relief. It was the most dangerous time of the year. Historians and farmers have a grim name for the months of March and April. They call it the Hungry Gap. Think about the math of survival. During the deep winter, you were eating the food you stored in October. You were rationing it, watching the barrels get lower and lower. By the time the snow melts, those barrels are empty. The dried meat is gone. The cheese is eaten, but here's the cruel twist of nature. Nothing is growing yet. The ground is brown, wet, and dead. The livestock that survived the winter are walking skeletons, their ribs showing through their skin, producing no milk. The hens have stopped laying eggs due to the lack of light. You are starving, but you are surrounded by the promise of food that you cannot eat yet. This is when people died. They didn't die in the blizzards of December. They died in the mud of April, with the sun shining on their faces, waiting for the first green shoots to appear. The landscape itself turned against them. The beautiful frozen highway of snow we discussed in Chapter 6 vanishes. It is replaced by a substance that creates a logistical nightmare, mud. Deep, sucking, freezing mud. The Norse called it ore. When the millions of tons of snow melted, the valleys of Scandinavia turned into swamps. You couldn't ski, you couldn't use a cart because the wheels would sink to the axles. Walking was a trudge through knee-deep sludge. The world became sticky and slow. Yet it was in this mud that the most critical gamble of the year took place. The Viking farmer had to decide exactly when to plant his seed. This was a game of Russian roulette played with nature. If you plant your barley or rye too early, a sudden killing frost, which is common in Scandinavia even in May, will freeze the seedlings in the ground. The crop dies. You starve next winter. But if you wait too long to plant, trying to be safe, the crop won't have enough time to mature before the darkness returns in autumn. The crop fails. You starve next winter. They had to read the signs of the earth with desperate precision. They looked at the budding of the birch trees, the behavior of the birds, the color of the mud. When the moment was right, the sheer physical exertion began. The Viking plow, the arar, was not the heavy metal machine we see in later centuries that turns the soil over in neat rows. It was a simple wooden spike, sometimes tipped with iron, that merely scratched a groove in the earth. To plow a field with this required immense force. You had to plow the field twice to break up the root systems. The oxen, weak from a winter of eating straw, would often collapse. The men, weak from the hungry gap, had to push them or even pull the plow themselves. It was a race against time, fueled by desperation. Every seed they threw into the ground was a seed they couldn't eat today. They were literally burying their food in the hope of a miracle. But while half the household fought the mud in the fields, the other half turned their eyes to the water. The sea was opening up. And this brings us to the smell that defined the Viking spring. It wasn't the smell of flowers. It was the smell of burning pine roots. It was the smell of tar. If the longhouse was the fortress of winter, the longship, the drakkar, was the vehicle of spring. But a wooden ship that sits on a beach all winter dries out. The planks shrink. The seams open up. If you put it in the water, it sinks. To wake the dragon, they had to bleed the forest. The production of wood tar churu was an industrial process. They would dig conical pits in the ground, fill them with the resinous roots of pine trees, cover them with turf, and set them on fire. The heat would force the black, sticky resin out of the wood, where it would drip into a collection pot at the bottom. This substance was liquid gold. It was the waterproofing that made Viking expansion possible. In the spring, the boat sheds were hives of activity. Men would be covered in this black, sticky goo, painting the hulls of the ships to seal them against the salt water. They would take wool, the same wool that kept them warm, mix it with tar and animal hair, and jam it into the gaps between the planks. This is called caulking. Then came the sails. The massive square wool sails, which had been carefully folded and stored in the rafters of the longhouse away from rats, were brought down. These sails were heavy. A wet wool sail could weigh hundreds of kilograms. To prevent them from rotting and to catch the wind better, the Vikings treated them with a mixture of horse fat, tar, and ochre. This gave the sails their distinctive red or blood red color. When you saw a red square on the horizon, you were looking at a piece of textile engineering designed to survive a North Atlantic gale. This preparation wasn't just a hobby. It was the economic necessity of the hungry gap. Why did the Vikings raid? We often think of them as bloodthirsty psychopaths who just like killing. But look at their situation in April. The food is gone. The new crops won't be ready for harvest until August or September. There is a 4-month gap where the village is resource poor. You can sit there and hope the fish bite, or you can get on a boat, sail south to England or Francia where the spring arrives earlier, and take what you need. The raiding season was driven by the empty belly of the north. They needed grain. They needed silver to buy grain. They needed slaves to work the fields so the warriors could keep fighting. The launch of the ships was the psychological climax of the survival story. Imagine the scene. The entire village gathers by the fjord. The ship, smelling of fresh tar and old wood, is dragged across logs into the water. The moment the hull hits the freezing water, the wood swells, sealing the cracks. It becomes a living thing. For the young men who had been cooped up in the smoky darkness of the longhouse for 5 months, stepping onto the deck of the ship was a release. The claustrophobia vanished. The horizon, which had been closed off by snow and darkness, suddenly opened up to infinity. They weren't just escaping the winter. They were escaping the limitations of their land. The harshness of the Scandinavian climate created a pressure cooker. It forged men and women who were incredibly tough, accustomed to hardship and desperate for resources. When you release that kind of pressure, it explodes outward. The Viking Age was essentially a survival mechanism that spilled over the borders of the map. But before they could sail into the history books, there was one final ritual. A ritual that connected the survival of the winter to the success of the raid. They had to ask for luck. And luck, in the Viking mind, was something that could be bought with blood. As the ships bobbed in the water, ready to leave, the priests would gather. The survival of the winter was a victory, but the ocean was a new enemy. They needed to ensure the gods were watching. Let's witness the departure and understand why the men who survived the ice were the most terrifying enemies the world had ever seen. The longships are in the water. The tar is fresh. The provisions are loaded. But before the first oar strikes the sea, there is one final piece of business that connects the darkness of winter to the violence of spring. It is the Sigblot, the victory sacrifice. We have to understand the Viking mindset here. They didn't view luck as a random occurrence. Luck, or heimingja, was a tangible force, a resource that could be stored, lost, or transferred. After surviving a winter that tried to kill them, their spiritual battery was drained. They needed to recharge it before facing the ocean. The Sigblot wasn't just a religious ritual, it was a psychological anchor. By offering up an animal, sometimes a horse, sometimes a goat, and sprinkling its blood on the stem of the ship, they were making a contract with Odin. They were trading life for life. They were saying, "We survived the ice. Now give us the wind." When the ships finally pushed off, leaving the fjord behind, the crew underwent a transformation. For 6 months, they had been farmers, carpenters, and weavers, huddled indoors. Now, they were the wolves of the sea. But here is the fascinating paradox. The very winter that imprisoned them was also the weapon that made them invincible. Consider the physical condition of a Viking raider in May. He is a survivor of the Hungry Gap. He is lean, hardened by the cold, and accustomed to functioning in low-light conditions. He has spent months inhaling smoke, eating fermented food, and sleeping on hard wood. His pain threshold is calibrated to the freezing point. Now, imagine this man landing on the coast of England or France. To the monks in the monasteries or the soldiers in the Frankish kingdoms, the spring weather is still chilly. They are wrapped in cloaks, shivering in the morning mist. To the Viking, who has just spent months in sub-zero temperatures and weeks on an open deck in the North Atlantic spray, the English spring feels like a tropical vacation. This thermal advantage was a tactical nightmare for their enemies. The Vikings could move faster, fight longer, and sleep rougher than anyone else in Europe. They didn't need tents. They didn't need supply wagons with warm food. They could march through a freezing rainstorm in just their wool tunics and feel perfectly comfortable, while their enemies were demoralized by the cold. The winter had stripped away their softness. It had turned them into biological tanks. But the winter provided more than just physical toughness. It provided the capital for their voyages. We often picture Vikings sailing out empty-handed and coming back full of gold. But that is historically inaccurate. They didn't leave empty-handed. They left with the harvest of ice. Remember the skiing hunters from Chapter 6? The endless hours spent tracking elk and trapping marten, fox, and beaver in the deep snow? That wasn't just for food. The winter furs were the currency of the medieval world. In the courts of Baghdad, Constantinople, and Paris, wearing the white fur of a northern ermine, or the dense pelt of a beaver was the ultimate status symbol. The Vikings were the only ones who could access this supply. The harsher the winter, the thicker the fur, and the more valuable the pelt. So, when the longships sailed, they were often laden with bales of furs harvested during the darkest months. They were also carrying amber, the gold of the north, which washes up on Scandinavian beaches during winter storms. This transforms our understanding of the raid. It wasn't always simple piracy. It was often aggressive trade. They would sail to a trading port like Dorestad or York. They would trade their winter harvest for silver coins, glass beads, and high-quality steel. If the trade went well, everyone was happy. If the trade went poorly, or if the locals looked weak, well then the merchant hat came off, and the helmet went on. The line between a trader and a raider was as thin as the edge of an axe. This dual purpose, trade and raid, was driven by the need to survive the next winter. They weren't hoarding gold because they were greedy capitalists. They were hoarding silver because silver doesn't rot. Think back to the Hungry Gap, the terror of running out of food in April. A Viking farmer could not rely solely on his crops. A bad summer, a wet harvest, or a plague of insects could mean that the granary would be empty by December. If that happened, the only thing that could save his family was purchasing grain from elsewhere. And to buy grain, you needed silver. So, when a Viking hacked through a monastery door and stole a silver chalice, he wasn't just stealing a shiny object. He was stealing insurance. He was stealing the guarantee that his children wouldn't starve next February. The violence of the Viking Age was inextricably linked to the climate of the Viking Age. The brutality of the raid was a direct reflection of the brutality of the weather. The ship itself became their new longhouse. The discipline they learned in the hall, the hierarchy, the law of the hall, the communal sleeping, transferred perfectly to the deck. A longship is an open boat. There is no below decks. You sleep on the deck boards, exposed to the sky. You sleep in leather sleeping bags called hufat, often 2 men to a bag for warmth, just like in the beds at home. The puppy pile survival tactic went to sea. They ate the same food, dried fish, stockfish, and sour whey, that they ate all winter. The ship was simply a mobile extension of their survival system. It allowed them to project their culture of endurance onto a terrified Europe. As they moved south, they encountered worlds that were incomprehensible to them. They saw cities made of stone, men who bathed in warm water every day, and people who had never seen the midnight sun. But they also saw weakness. They saw societies that had grown soft in the warmth, and they exploited it. However, the raiding season was short. The ocean that allowed them to leave would eventually turn against them again. As summer turned to autumn, the North Atlantic would begin to churn with the early gales of the next winter. The days would start to shorten. The clock was ticking. Every Viking captain knew that he had a hard deadline. He had to gather enough wealth, whether through blood or barter, and get back across the sea before the iron door slammed shut. If he stayed too long in the south, seduced by the wine and the warmth, he risked being trapped by the storms. Or worse, he risked returning home too late to prepare the farm for the coming dark. The return journey was often more dangerous than the raid itself. The ships were heavy now, loaded down with silver, slaves, wine, and weapons. They sat lower in the water. A heavy ship is harder to handle in rough seas. Many successful crews vanished on the way home, claimed by the sea goddess Ran, their silver dragging them to the bottom. But for those who made it back, the sight of the Norwegian or Icelandic coast in late September was a moment of complex emotion. They were returning to the prison. They were returning to the cold. But they were returning as kings. They would beach the ships. The silver would be weighed. The slaves would be put to work harvesting the last of the crops. The foreign wine would be cracked open. And then the sky would turn gray. The first frost would crunch under their boots. The sun would dip lower. The cycle was closing. The great doors of the longhouse would be unbarred to let them in, and then barred shut behind them. The timber, the turf, and the fire were waiting. They had survived the world. Now they had to survive the winter again. But this time, they were different. This time they had stories. This time they had silver. And this time they knew that no matter how cold it got, they had defeated the ice before, and they would do it again. But how does this story end for the civil? Everything that rises must set. The sun that returns in the spring must eventually sink back into the winter darkness. And so it was with the Viking Age itself. We have spent 9 chapters looking at how these people conquered the cold through engineering, community, and sheer force of will. But if you visit Scandinavia today, you won't find families sleeping in a pile on the floor of a turf-covered hall with a cow in the living room. The longhouse is gone. The fires have burned down to ash. The end of the Viking Age wasn't just caused by lost battles in England like Stamford Bridge in 1066. It was caused by a fundamental shift in how they lived, believed, and heated their homes. The ultimate enemy of the Viking way of life wasn't a soldier, it was progress. The first domino to fall was the architecture itself. As the Viking Age transitioned into the medieval period, a new technology arrived from the south, the chimney. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at once, but the concept of venting smoke changed everything. When you move the fire from the center of the room to the wall, and you funnel the smoke out of a stone tube, you clear the air. The smoke layer we talked about in Chapter 2 vanished. You could stand up straight, you could breathe. But this comfort came at a social cost. The central hearth was the gravitational pull of the household. It forced everyone to face each other, to share the same heat, to listen to the same stories. When the fire moved to the wall, the room was divided. The hall began to break up into separate rooms. Privacy, that concept that was so dangerous in the deep winter, became attainable. The communal puppy pile of sleeping bodies was replaced by private chambers. The collective heat was lost, replaced by individual isolation. The fierce, tight-knit bond of the Longhouse crew began to fray. Simultaneously, the spiritual armor changed. Christianity slowly dismantled the old ways. The Velva and her herbal magic were branded as witchcraft. The corpse wall and the mounds were replaced by burial in consecrated ground, often far from the farm. The fear of the Draugr was replaced by the fear of hell. Even the great Yule feast, Hull, was rebranded. They still drank ale and ate pork, but they did it to celebrate the birth of a carpenter from the desert, not the turning of the wheel of the year. The Winter War became less of a spiritual battle against frost giants and more of a mundane season of endurance. But the most tragic chapter of this ending didn't happen in Norway or Sweden. It happened in the Vikings' most ambitious outpost, Greenland. This is the ultimate case study in adapt or die. The Vikings had settled Greenland during the medieval warm period, a time when the climate was surprisingly mild. They built their longhouses, grazed their cattle, and lived the Norse life on the edge of the known world. But then the climate betrayed them. Around the year 1300, the Little Ice Age began. Temperatures plummeted. The glaciers advanced. The sea ice locked the fjords tight, cutting off trade ships from Europe. The Norse settlers in Greenland were faced with a choice. They shared the island with the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit. The Inuit thrived in the cold. They wore tailored sealskin parkas that were waterproof and warm. They hunted ringed seals through the ice. They used blubber lamps for heat. They had perfected winter survival. The Vikings, however, were stubborn. They were Europeans. They refused to adopt the ways of the Skrellings, their derogatory term for the Inuit. They insisted on wearing wool, which is heavy and useless when wet and frozen in Arctic conditions. They insisted on raising cows and sheep, animals that required hay, which could no longer grow in the freezing summers. They refused to eat fish or seal meat in sufficient quantities, clinging to their European diet even as they starved. Archaeologists excavating the final Viking farms in Greenland found a horror story. They found the bones of the hunting dogs, which had been eaten. They found the bones of the calves and the lambs, eaten down to the marrow. And finally they found the Vikings themselves, dead in their beds, frozen and malnourished. They died surrounded by a food source, the ocean, that they refused to exploit because of cultural pride. They died clinging to the longhouse way of life in a world that had moved on. It is a grim reminder that tradition, without adaptation, is a suicide pact. Back in Scandinavia, the survivors adapted. They stopped being Vikings and became Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians. They built log cabin stuga that were easier to heat than the massive halls. They adopted glass windows. They imported stoves. The wild, desperate struggle against the winter was tamed by technology. Yet the legacy of that struggle remains burned into the DNA of the North. You can see it today. You see it in the concept of hygge in Denmark or koselig in Norway. It is that obsession with coziness, with lighting candles, with wrapping up in blankets and drinking hot coffee while the storm rages outside. That isn't just a design trend. It is a genetic memory. It is the modern echo of the longhouse. It is the feeling of safety that comes from creating a warm circle of light in the middle of a dark, hostile universe. We also still use their technology, even if we don't realize it. Every time you put on a wool sweater, you are wearing the armor of the North. Every time you use a comb, you are using a tool that the Vikings prized above gold. Every time you ski, you are paying homage to Ullr. And every time you complain about the cold, you are participating in the oldest conversation in human history. The Viking Age is over. The dragon ships have rotted into the peat bogs. The swords are rusted in the museums. But the winter is still here. Tonight, when the sun goes down and the temperature drops, look out your window. Imagine the world without streetlights. Imagine it without electricity. Imagine the wind howling against a wall of turf, the smell of peat smoke stinging your eyes, and the warmth of 80 bodies pressing against the dark. For a few hundred years, a group of people managed to thrive in conditions that should have killed them. They didn't just survive the winter, they embraced it. They turned the ice into a highway and the darkness into a story. They reminded us that humans are not designed to be comfortable. We are designed to overcome. So, the next time you feel the chill of winter on your neck, don't shiver. Stand up straight, close the door, light a fire, and remember the longhouse. Thank you for watching. If you survived this journey through the ice, leave a comment below telling us which part of the Viking winter would have broken you first, the smoke, the darkness, or the sour meat. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into the lost worlds of history.